process that Darwin discovered didn't start from nothing. It had to start from, well, a reasonably complicated chemical beginning, which was the first self-replicating molecule. You can't, I mean, natural selection can't get going until you have genetics, and so you've got to have genetics. And that's not a trivial problem, and it's a problem that actually hasn't yet been solved.
Well, in fact, actually, that's kind of interesting, because it's true that many people think that evolution has to do with the origin of life, but it's really the origin of the diversity of life. I thought of this in the context of the universe, and we may talk about it in a while, but there was no life on Earth when it was created, and there was no life potentially for maybe, well, maybe a few 100 million years. But then there was life. And so there's the moment when life, when you go from chemistry to biology. It seems to me at some point that for many people, in fact, when they talk about something from nothing again, especially those who feel that the something requires a creator, that the origin of life itself, that is the creation of something from nothing.
The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and we don't know when life began, but probably after about 500 million years, but probably around about 4 billion years. For the next couple of billion years, there were nothing but bacteria.
Well, how would you respond? I suspect I know how, but how would you respond? So people say, look, we don't understand the origin of life on Earth, and therefore, God must have done it.
Even theologians don't buy that. I mean, sophisticated theologians. But it's what they call the God of the gaps argument. It's pushing God into the few remaining gaps in our understanding. Before Darwin came along, the whole of life was one big gap, one gigantic gap. And now we're pushed back to the origin of life, this chemical event, and that is a gap which will be filled. Even if it isn't filled, it would be bad logic, bad science, bad philosophy to say, oh, I don't understand it, therefore God did it. I mean, that's a pathetically bad piece of arguing.
It's a lazy argument, certainly.
It's a lazy argument. It doesn't even explain anything, of course, because it leaves open explaining where God came from. And so, I mean, the beauty of what Darwin did was to show how you can get godlike things, I mean, complicated things like human brains, how you could get godlike things starting from almost nothing. So to suddenly re-import a godlike thing at the beginning of the process is just a cowardly evasion of scientific responsibility.
That's one of the things, of course, that where cosmology comes in, that one of the things that, but it relates to evolution too, because the thing that makes evolution so difficult for many people to appreciate, from my experience and I'm sure from yours, is that life has been around for a long time, and a human time scale is very short, and it's very difficult to imagine such long time scales. So even if rare events happen in the evolution of life, with 4.5 billion years, there's lots of time for many rare events to happen. Similarly, in the universe, the thing that people don't realize is that rare events happen all the time, because the universe is big and old. And the example I've used probably on this stage before, to me, it's one of an amazing example of that is the reason we're here before life, the fact that as I've often written, that we're all stardust. During the Big Bang, the only elements that were made during the first moments of the Big Bang were hydrogen, helium, and a little bit of lithium. And lithium may be important for some people in this audience, but the really important stuff, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, was made in stars. And the only way it can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to die so you would be born. But stars die only about once per 100 years per galaxy. And so it seems like, how could that happen? And in fact, but nevertheless, in the age of our galaxy, 200 million stars have exploded. Events are happening all the time, and the same is true in a biological context. And I think it's the fact that we live a brief 100 years or so, and that makes evolution so difficult for people to comprehend.
People, many of them think that evolution is talking about monkeys giving birth to humans. They don't realize that it's 25 million years ago that we had a monkey for an ancestor.
So we have a common ancestor with monkeys. It's not as if...
Well, that's
and then
right.
people would say, why are there monkeys today if evolution happened?
Yeah. The point is, evolution is a constantly branching, diverging process. 25 million years ago, our ancestors might have looked like monkeys. They would have been the common ancestor of modern monkeys and modern humans and modern apes. We are, of course, apes. That would have been the common ancestor. If you'd been handed it, you probably would have called it a monkey. I mean, it would have been monkey-like, and you would have called it...
Talk about the fact that the great apes are doing poorly. In fact, we are living, due to humans, in probably one of the greatest periods of extinction of life on the planet. More species are probably going extinct now at a faster rate than, other than perhaps when there were global catastrophes like a meteor hitting the Earth and killing the dinosaurs, perhaps, or something like that. But one of the things that may be worth stressing, especially when we talk about intelligent design, which we won't talk about much,
I'm all for intelligent design. I'd like to see more intelligent design.
Yeah, I'd like to see, exactly. Yeah. But in nature, one of the arguments that's worth pointing out when people argue that we're designed and the whole Earth was created so we would be here, and we'll get to that in a moment, is the fact to realize that probably 99.999% of all species that have ever existed are extinct.
Yeah.
Which doesn't suggest good design.
No. Well, nothing suggests design. Well, no, that's not quite true. I mean, superficially, things look designed until you look closely at them, and then you see all the bad design features, all the what an engineer would see as designed for.
The other argument that I often get when talking is first is the monkeys and people argument, and then the next one is if evolution really happened, why isn't it happening now? And so,
well, it is. It's happening all the time, but once again, on a timescale that's mostly too slow for us to see. We are condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow, too small a timescale to see evolution going on in the sort of interesting animals that we like to see. We can see it in bacteria, only too vividly, because of course that's why antibiotic resistance is such an immensely important medical problem. If doctors at the time of the invention of penicillin had had their Darwinian wits about them, they would have been able to predict that resistance to antibiotics would have evolved very fast.
And the reason is this one discovery, which is really the reason I wrote the new book in some sense, the most inexplicable discovery in the last century, the fact that empty space has energy. That if you take a region of space, get rid of all the particles and all the radiation, everything, that space weighs something. There's nothing there, but it has energy. And it's changed everything about the future of the universe and the present, and maybe we'll talk about it. But it is something that is so inexplicable that physicists have latched on a possible solution, which is very unpalatable to many of us, but may be true. Why does empty space have the energy it does? We don't have any idea. In fact, it flies in the face of all fundamental calculations we can perform. If we perform fundamental calculations, we predict a number that's 120 orders of magnitude wrong. It's the worst prediction in all of physics, so we never used to talk about it. But in fact, there may be another explanation, and that is if the energy of empty space were much bigger, see, if you put energy in empty space, it's gravitationally repulsive. It blows, it doesn't suck. Okay? And that means that it's causing the current expansion of the universe to speed up, which is unprecedented, was almost unbelievable. But that means, well, and we'll talk about what it means for the future, but if the energy were much greater, then the universe would have started speeding up much earlier. And in fact, it would have started speeding up before galaxies formed. And that gravitational repulsion would have caused matter to move apart before it could collapse into galaxies. And that means there'd be no galaxies. But if there are no galaxies, there'd be no stars. If there are no stars, there'd be no planets. If there are no planets, there'd be no astronomers. And so the universe is the way it is because astronomers are here to measure it, is the argument. And it sounds funny, but it's actually maybe true. It's something called the anthropic principle. But if it's true, it means this fundamental constant in nature is an accident. And there may be many universes in which that number is different. But in those universes, there aren't people around or beings around, perhaps, to ask the question. So it addresses in one of the fundamental aspects of the question of why is there something rather than
You are
nothing.
telling us that matter arose spontaneously out of nothing,
Yeah.
which I find an immensely exciting idea, but many people will find it mind-boggling.
It amazes me because the purpose of the book, to some extent, is to say something remarkable. And you were kind enough in the afterward to point out the analogy to Darwin, and I was pretentious to make it, perhaps. But the physicist Steven Weinberg said, science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. Because until you have science, everything's a miracle. And what Darwin showed, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, is this miracle is actually plausible from basic principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. That you can produce us without a creator, without an intelligence. And what we've learned is remarkably this question, which is, in the sense of cosmology, in my mind, the last bastion of those people who feel there must be a creator, is the fact that it is plausible, based on everything we now know, that a universe could come from nothing. Now, that doesn't mean it did come from nothing any more than Darwin's argument implied that life absolutely originated by chemistry. We don't know that yet. Similarly, we can't prove that the universe arose from nothing, but the discoveries in physics and cosmology have led us to realize that it's increasingly plausible, and I find that remarkable and worth celebrating. And one of the examples of that, and there's a number, but maybe some of them are too much for us to talk about tonight, is this remarkable fact that nothing is unstable, that empty space is unstable. The laws of quantum mechanics, combined with gravity, will tell you that if you have empty space there, and you wait long enough, particles will be created. And if you wait long enough, empty space will always produce a universe full of matter. And it's not a scam. There's no violation of energy conservation. It's from the fact that gravity can have negative energy as well as positive energy. And so nothing is unstable. And in fact, that's the first answer to why there's something rather than nothing, is that nothing's unstable. The big surprise would be if there was nothing, not that there's something. Now, the problem, of course, of saying that is people say, that's not nothing. You know, that's not, and you know, and it's an interesting problem, because when I've discussed this with theologians and philosophers, some of them, and you ask, you know, what's nothing? And my argument is that these are scientific questions, not philosophical or theological ones. And I think the nothing that Aristotle would have had, or say Thomas Aquinas, or any of the people who first asked why is there something rather than nothing, that nothing would have been an eternal empty void, namely empty space. But once I argue that empty space can create something, then immediately I'm told that's not nothing.
Yeah.
And then I show that space itself can be created from nothing, and then I'm told that's not nothing. And then I say, well, and because there are still laws of physics. And then I argue that, in fact, the laws of physics, for the reasons we've discussed, the anthropic principle, there may be many universes, and it's quite likely that even the laws of physics themselves arose by accident when the universe was created. So even the laws aren't there. And I'm told that's not nothing. And the definition of theologians, I think, for nothing is that from which only God can create something. And I find that as sort of content-free, although I guess I think I say in the book that you know, maybe I'm not fit to talk about nothing because theologians and philosophers are experts in that. This allows us to segue to something which we would be remiss if we did not discuss, which is religion, and science and religion in some sense. You've set out, well, we both enjoy teaching science, and we want to, and one of my goals and your goals is to help people understand science, but I think it's fair to say that one of your purposes in doing that is to destroy religion, is it not?
Well, I love truth. I love scientific truth. And in my own field of biology, ever since Darwin, we've got a very, very long way towards understanding it. And I'm now learning that in your field, we're coming stunningly close to understanding everything. And that is such a beautiful idea, such a wonderful, exciting, exhilarating idea, that it is, I would go as far as to say, an obscenity to fill a child's mind with a parochial, small-minded, petty, medieval alternative, which has nothing going for it whatever.
It sounds like we're preaching to the converted, but I bet in the question period we'll find we're not.
What was that quote from Stephen Weinberg that you just...
Science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God, it just makes it possible to not believe in
Yeah,
God.
I think that's too weak. In the following sense, that it doesn't just make God redundant, it doesn't just give God nothing to do, which it certainly does. I mean, biology, ever since Darwin, has left God nothing to do. And it now sounds as though physics is doing the same thing. But a God who has nothing to do is still a complex, improbable entity of exactly the kind that we spent our lives explaining. So the whole Darwinian enterprise and the whole enterprise that you're engaged in physics is to explain how we can get to things like gods and explain them. And so if you suddenly then import a God at the beginning of the universe, that's a betrayal of the entire scientific enterprise. It's not just that God's not necessary. God's an excrescence, a carbuncle on the face of science.
Well, okay, in fact, I agree with it. Actually, we were talking earlier, I think it's even stronger than that, in some sense. God is not, in order for God to do everything God is purported to do, God has to be much more complex than we are. In fact, you're imagining a being of incredible complexity, in fact, in religion, unfathomable complexity, and you're just positing it by fiat. But you're saying that the complexity of the regular complexity that you or I can't be made by natural processes, and you're postulating that the pre-existence of something that's far more complex than we are.
Precisely. I mean, that's exactly right. And not only does God have to be a master physicist and so on, he's got to be in telepathic communication with everybody praying to him. He's got to know all our sins. He's got to forgive us if he feels like it. He's got to cure people of cancer if he's asked to. I mean, all those sorts of things which are simply adding to the problem. So I think the Weinberg quote that you gave is just too weak. I think we can say positively.
Well, I think at the same time, and I think one has to be careful, and I try and say in the book that I can't prove that there's no intelligence governing the universe at some vague level, in a deistic level, or even a theistic level, where you say, well, maybe there is some intelligence that caused it all to happen. I can't prove that. What I can say is there's absolutely no evidence of that. That I can say as a scientist. But I can't really say that I can prove, therefore, by lack of evidence, you can't prove it in the negative. But nevertheless, that's not the same as saying, people say, well, therefore, God can't disprove the existence of God. But that kind of God has nothing to do with the God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam. It's a personal God, has nothing to do with that. It's a giant leap of illogic to go from that kind of God to a God that cares about us. And so I'm always amazed that people, even in the case of cosmology, saying, well, there's room for God at the beginning of the universe, somehow say that must mean that Jesus Christ
died for our sins. I mean,
yeah,
yes, right.
There's no logical connection between those two. And
no, but I mean, I've been caught out with this before. I've said something similar to what you've said, and I've said, well, of course, maybe there could be a deistic God, but that's very, very different from the God of the Christians or the Jews. And I've been pounced on later. Dawkins believes in a deistic God. And I want to reiterate what I said about the Weinberg quote. Not only you cannot, of course, disprove a deistic God any more than you could disprove leprechauns and hobgoblins and things. But you can say something much stronger than that, which is that even a deistic God would still have to be exactly the kind of thing that we spent our lives explaining and have gone a long way towards succeeding. Intelligence, whether it's godlike or anything else, intelligence comes late in the universe. Intelligence comes at the end of a long process of evolution.
The end, unless we're the end.
No, I didn't mean the end. Intelligence comes after a long period of development, of evolution, starting from literally nothing as we've now learned, and then chemistry takes over, biology takes over, and so there may be in the universe godlike beings. There probably are life forms which are so much more advanced than us that if we were to meet them, we would fall to our knees and worship them. But they would still be the product of a process, explicable process, of evolutionary development. They would not be gods in the sense of having created the laws of physics or created the universe or created life or something of that sort.
Okay, and I think, you know, that's true, and there's another stronger thing I think one could say. When people ask me if I'm an atheist, as a scientist, you're not certain of anything. There are things that are probable and things that are improbable. And what you can do is you can say, I can say, looking at the universe, that I can't say that there's no God, but I can say the universe looks just like a universe that would be created without one. And moreover, that just like I can't say, using Bertrand Russell's famous analogy of a China teapot, I can't prove that there's no teapot orbiting Jupiter. But what I can say is extremely improbable. And so what I can say about the universe is that I can't say that there isn't a God, but I can say that everything we know makes it, for me, as a scientist, extremely improbable. And so that doesn't, you know, you may say that doesn't make me an atheist, but in fact, I would argue that I'm not. Our dear friend, our late friend, Christopher Hitchens, who was a friend of both of ours and a wonderful man, I would call myself what he said. I'm an anti-theist. Namely, I can't prove that there's no God. I just wouldn't want to live in a universe with one. I'm upfront about that bias. No, I wouldn't want to live with Saddam Hussein in the sky.
That's right. I mean, Christopher Hitchens' reason for that was a sort of political one, that living in a universe with a God would be like living with a divine Kim Il-sung. I mean,
exactly. It doesn't put you in jail for a year, but for eternity. For eternity. For doing the silliest things.
So his was a moral reason, which I respect. But mine would be a scientific reason. I wouldn't wish to. I mean, if there were a God which undermined the whole scientific enterprise, then science would be pointless. There would be no point doing science if there's a sort of magician deciding what's going to happen and changing the laws of physics at will or inventing them in the first place. So that's a different reason for not wanting to live in a universe, and I'm glad to say there is no evidence.
In fact, I was on a stage once with several members of the Vatican, and I asked if they believed in the virgin birth, and I couldn't get an answer from them, which amazed me. I mean, because in fact, I think we both agree that most people what people want to do is they want to believe, to take a line from the X-Files, they want to believe in believing. And so most people who of faith, I think, in our society, naturally pick and choose from the doctrine those things they find absolutely ridiculous and throw out.
Yeah.
And the question is, and the Pope would say that's not palatable, and I would tend to agree with the Pope. I think if you can't believe some of the stuff and you need to throw it out, just forget the whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, that probably is a good place to get close to stopping, because I will say that one of the things that impacted upon me the most in our discussions and listening to you is the notion that we need to consciousness raise. So at least the question, just questioning the existence of a deity, doesn't become akin in our society to being evil, to being someone you don't trust. That just questioning, which is really at the basis of science, which is at the basis of progress, should be something we revere rather than revile. And so I applaud the efforts that you have made to raise people's consciousness, including my own. And I'll give the final example. One that I think I heard on this stage the first time you might have talked here was a wonderful example that is worth repeating, which is a picture at Christmas time of three children and three little kids, and one of them, and it says, and they're all playing together in this play, and one, it says,
well, they're the three wise men in the Passion, in the nativity play.
And it says this one's a Muslim child, and this one's a Christian child, and I don't know if one's a Jewish child. And then you pointed out, how dare we say a Muslim child? Why not say a
4 years old?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
you know, a libertarian child, or
Yeah.
a neoconservative child,
Postmodernist child.
So I think we need to and one of the ways to do that, I think, is have frank discussions about issues that we're often afraid to discuss in public, and I'm happy that we were able to do it here. So thank you very much. We'll go for a wrap.